Good morning, welcome to Bennett's Bike Social. My name's Martin and welcome to the launch of the 2024 Husqvarna Svartpilen 801. Welcome to the launch of the 2024 Husqvarna Svartpilen 801, a bike that's just made picking a middleweight sporty naked bike a little bit more interesting. Quick recap for those unfamiliar with a Svartpilen. It's a model range that Husqvarna have had for about 10 years now. They've built it in 401 and 701 cc single cylinder configurations. It is Husqvarna's kind of scrambler-y, street truckery style roadster. It's a product of, well, when KTM took over the Husqvarna brand about 10 years ago. And this, the 801, is their biggest, most powerful and first multi-cylinder Svartpilen. So what we have is a new 799cc parallel twin engine. It's all mod-con, so 4-valve heads, twin cams, water cooling, ride-by-wire throttle, loads of electronics, which we'll get to in a bit, making just over 100 horsepower. And it has an interesting 285-degree crank, gives it the same firing intervals and feel and sound as a 75-degree V-twin. Now, if some of that sounds familiar, there's good reason for that, and that's because the engine is the same engine as you might find in KTM's 790 Duke. And, well, that's not the only bit of the bike that's similar to, or taken shamelessly from, the 790 Duke. This bike kind of, if we're being a little bit simplistic, is a bit of a badge engineering job. So the frame, steel tubular frame, is pretty similar to the 790 Dukes. Husqvarna was saying last night, or some of their technicians and engineers were saying, that the frame is slightly different. I think there's slightly different geometry, slightly more relaxed rake angle. And they say apparently you can't just swap the frame from this over onto a 790 Duke, but they do look pretty similar to me. The swing arm is definitely the same part, and suspension wise you've got WP, which obviously owned by KTM, no surprise there. So yeah, there are bits and pieces of this. In fact, there are a couple of KTM logos on the bike if you look closely enough. But before we start making too many assumptions and sweeping statements, let's be clear, this is definitely not just a 790 Duke with a couple of different badges. There are some changes, which we'll get into in due course. Now, first things first, if you hear the word 790 Duke and you think, it's going to be one of those lurid hooligans of a bike, I have to say, first impressions are that the 801, the Svartpilen, is actually quite mild, not mild-mannered, but it's got quite a nice temper to it. It doesn't just jump out of your hands and head for the horizon with a load of anger and silliness. Actually, the whole thing is kind of quite well balanced. It's quite comfortable. The fueling is pretty mild, even in this most aggressive of the riding modes. And the suspension certainly isn't too stiff. It's quite nice and plush, well damped. You can hit some bumpy roads that we've been on earlier, and it soaks up the worst of it. So yeah, first impressions are that this is actually a really nice, really friendly motorbike. Ooh, where are we going here? So the styling is like previous Svartpilens. It's scrambler-esque, it's flat track-esque, but it's certainly not retro. It's a very modern, maybe even a slightly futuristic design, but you can definitely say it's been influenced by Husqvarna's past, their dirty past. I guess things like the slightly flat track or very flat track style Pirelli MT60 RS tyres give the game away. But to be absolutely honest, the rest of the bike is pure street bike. The suspension is WP at both ends, but it's not like super long travel suspension. It's not off-road suspension in any way, shape or form. There is some adjustment. There's adjustment for, let's try and remember, rebound on the right and compression on the left, I think, on the forks, which, by the way, there's no damping adjustment on the 790 Duke, so that tells you that the Husqvarna has a higher spec suspension straight off the bat. And the whole bike, yeah, the seat height is 820 millimeters, so it's a very approachable seat height. It's certainly not a big, tall, towering thing. The wheel sizes a standard 17-inch front and back, 120 at the front, 180 at the back. So again, there's no tricky off-road influence or flat track influenced odd sizes going on. I think there might have been a previous Svartpilen that had an 18-inch front. It might have been the 701. And there's nothing wrong with that, although it can make choosing replacement tyres a little bit trickier. So this is pretty conventional. The brakes are 300mm, I think, discs, 2 discs at the front, and 4-piston radial calipers. I think they are J-Juan or Hotjuan, even though they've got Husqvarna branding on. And the whole plot, the whole thing weighs, according to Husqvarna, well, they claim it's 181 kilos dry. Personally, I hate dry weight figures. They're complete nonsense. They have no relevance to what you end up riding. But quietly they say it's 191 kilos with a full 14-litre tank. Now 191 kilos, that is a little bit heavier than a 790 Duke, but in the grand scheme of things, it's still a pretty lightweight bike. And it feels extremely manageable and extremely agile, flicking from one side to the next. It's definitely a very easy bike to get on with. Yeah, and like I said, even though I guess there's a hint of the past, of Husqvarna's past, this little cross brace on the handlebar, another little touch to the off-road side, there is nothing old-fashioned or old school about the way it rides or the way it feels. I guess looking down here, you've got a colour 5-inch TFT dash, which is a little bit cluttered. There's a lot going on here, but it kind of mostly does make sense. And there's totally modern electronics, full rubber wire throttle. You have a choice of 3 or 4 riding modes, depending on whether you plump for the optional extra pack, which we'll get into in a bit. There's an IMU, which means you can have lean sensitive cornering ABS and cornering traction control. And if you go for the optional extras, you can get into customizing the amount of slip that it allows you. It will give you engine braking control. It will give you, what else? Anti-wheelie, adjustable anti-wheelie. So there's a huge amount you can get into if that's your bag. There's a 2-way quick shifter as standard. Another little touch that the 790 Duke doesn't have as standard. And apparently there's Bluetooth connectivity. And how does it all feel? Well, unsurprisingly, it is a lot of fun. The surprising bit is that it isn't just this kind of super aggressive, ultra sporty street bike. There's quite a lot of strings to its bow. If you're riding through town, the motor is very smooth with unbelievably slick fueling. Even in the most aggressive riding mode, the throttle response is exactly what you expect it to be. It is so lovely. But when you get out of the town and into these twisty mountain roads, there is so much fun to be had. I wouldn't say the engine's revvy. There's plenty of poke down low and the gearing is really well matched to the roads, but it's definitely an engine that feels like it gives you its best if you put a bit into it as well. Peak torque is up at I think 8,000 revs, and that's given a total rev range of about 10,000. So yeah, while there is plenty of smooth linear punch at the bottom end, it's definitely an engine that rewards someone who puts a bit of effort into it. If I had to be a bit picky, I'd say the one bit of the powertrain that maybe slightly lets the side down is the gearbox, or specifically changing up through the gearbox, where it's just a little bit sticky and clicky. It's maybe not the sweetest thing in the world, even though there is a quick shifter. I do find myself using the clutch to give it some smooth manners. Downshifts are pretty good, and yes, the quick shifter's 2-way, and that's pretty nice. Chassis wise, everything is really pleasant and really easy to get on with as well. You're not sat in any peculiar riding position. It's all very organic and natural. It feels just like riding a road bike. You wouldn't know, like the pegs aren't in a peculiar position or the handlebars aren't especially wide. So even though it kind of has a unique look to it, and even though there is that slightly off-road influence to its aesthetic, it certainly doesn't feel like an off-road bike in any way, shape or form from the saddle. The suspension is so well chosen. It's neither too stiff nor too soft, it's not too long. You can hammer over some rough roads and the ride quality is excellent. Maybe, if we're going to be really picky, maybe a touch soft on the shock, soft in the damping. Although, like the forks, the damping is adjustable on the shock, which it isn't on the 790 Duke. So again, more adjustability, more slightly higher spec components. But yeah, when we're riding around fairly sportily, the chassis keeps its composure and its attitude really nicely. There's no shortage of ground clearance. It's not bouncing around, it's not jabbing the bumps in the road through my spine. It's such a pleasant thing to be getting on with. Now, the 790 Duke that this shares many of its fundamental components with is a bit of a favourite here at Bennett's Bike Social. Last summer we ran a 4-bike group test with the 790 Duke and the Honda Hornet and Suzuki GSX 8S and Yamaha MT-07, and I'd say by and large the KTM was the winner of the test, the bike that most people enjoyed most of the time. But if we did have some criticisms of that 790, it was that it perhaps felt a bit plasticky, a little bit lacking in kind of class, a little bit, I don't know really, maybe just a little bit unsubstantial if you're a more experienced rider. But I have to say, all of that feels like it's been addressed for this Husqvarna. It does feel a step up in kind of class and quality. The build quality on this thing is very nice. I have to say my particular favourite is the exposed rear subframe. It's this kind of great big aluminium casting, but it's what you can see is the back of the bike is the subframe. It's structural. There's no cosmetic plastic covers over the top of it. And I have to say, all in all, it just feels like a nice, substantial, grown-up motorbike. Now, with that said, there is unfortunately an equally substantial grown-up price tag with it. The Husqvarna Svartpilen 801 starts at £10,499 in the UK, which is quite a lot. That is £2,500 more than a 790 Duke currently costs. And for that, you do get the quick shifter, you do get the Bluetooth connectivity, but you don't get all the riding modes. You'll need the dynamic pack for that, which is another 360 quid, which takes us up towards 11 grand. There's also an optional cruise control system for the bike, which does require a new left switch cube. I think that's about 250 quid, so that does then take you well north of 11 grand, and we are getting into some pretty spicy money at that point. So how do they justify the additional cost, or what would explain the additional cost? Well, part of it is that this bike is built or assembled in Austria, ironically by KTM, whereas the KTM 790 Duke is built in China by CFMoto. Confused? Good. There is some CFMoto handiwork in this bike, in that the motors, these 800cc parallel twins, are built and assembled by CFMoto, and then they're shipped to Austria, where the rest of the bike is put together. So I guess slightly higher production cost comes from it being made, or at least kind of bolted together, put together in Austria. Yeah, there's also the higher spec suspension front and back, there's the higher standard electronic spec, and the motor is also slightly more powerful than a 790 Duke. So where that bike is 94 horsepower is standard, and that's been chosen so that it can be A2 restrictable, the Svartpilen is not. It is 103 horsepower. A small difference, but an important one if you are a younger rider looking for an A2 compliant bike. This is not it, although apparently there might well be an AT restrictable version in the future. So how do we sum up the Svartpilen 801 then? Well, I guess we should probably start with how it looks, its visual appeal, because like the Svartpilens before it, it doesn't kind of conform to any simple single motorcycling stereotype, or doesn't fit neatly into a pigeonhole. There's definitely some scrambler in it, there's definitely some flat track in it, there's also definitely some conventional regular roadster in it. But it does all of that without anything retro or old-fashioned. It's a thoroughly modern or even slightly futuristic design. And in that regard, it's kind of different to any other bike that's on sale today. And I think that breadth in its design is reflected or mirrored in how it feels to ride dynamically. Again, it doesn't fit into a single style of motorbike. It doesn't feel just like a scrambler or just like a roadster. It really has a kind of a rounded three-dimensional personality, which I've been quite surprised by. When you ride it, it feels like the kind of bike that would make a really great cross-city commuter, because it's slim and light and not too tall, with absolutely fantastic smooth fueling. It feels like the kind of bike that would demolish a load of inner city congestion. It would slice through traffic without any effort at all. But more than that, out on the open road, it feels like a thoroughly pleasant, relaxed roadster. It's got a really comfortable riding position. The suspension feels like it's fairly soft. It's kind of very comfortable. It's like it's been focused on ride quality rather than outright aggressive chassis stiffness. And the motor's pretty smooth through almost all of its rev range. It doesn't egg you on into doing silly things. It doesn't have the kind of power delivery where you feel like you have to absolutely flog its guts out to get any enjoyment from it. But when you do want to get a lick on, this has more than enough performance. There's more than 100 horsepower here, which is plenty to be getting on with. And it delivers it at the top end of the revs with plenty of fire and excitement. The chassis is also very capable when you want to get a bit of a shufty on. There's plenty of ground clearance. The brakes are strong. The bite is quite gentle, but there is power there to be found. And of course, there's as much or as little electronic assistance in all the complex adjustable rider aids as you want from your motorcycle. So it really works across a broad range of motorcycling. Now, I think probably before I came here today, I'd imagined it would be a bit simpler than that. I'd imagined it was pretty much a 790 Duke in a trendy new suit. But I've been really impressed at how some small changes have actually given this a very distinctive character. It does feel like a very different bike to the 790. Much more rounded and versatile, much more sort of three-dimensional type of bike. But for all of that blowing smoke up its exhaust pipe, we should probably get to some downsides and find some little bits to talk about that aren't quite perfect. I would say the first one that springs to mind would be the gearbox. It feels a little bit stiff and notchy and not super slick, especially on upshifts. That's not something unique to the quick shifter. I think even ignoring that and just using the clutch normally, it still feels a little bit reluctant and a bit unwilling to go through upshifts. Now that might just be the bike that I was riding today. I didn't overhear any other tester complain of similar issues, but you've got to call these things as you see them. The second thing would be the rear shock. Now for 90% of the time, 95% of the time, it's a really well set up suspension, but as far as the chassis goes, I'd say when we started coming across some of the bigger kind of lumps and bumps in the road and hitting them at a bit more speed, it's the shocks damping that's the first bit that feels like it's getting towards the edge of its comfort zone. It feels like it kind of moves through its stroke quite a lot and takes a long time to recover. Now, there is a damping adjuster on there, and I must admit I didn't go in and start adding any damping to see whether that would give it a bit more control. Maybe it would, but as far as the chassis goes, that's the first thing that springs to mind. But the gearbox and the shock are fairly small things. I guess the biggest issue that the Svartpilen is going to face is its price. So in the UK it's £10,499, and that's before you start adding on the dynamic pack of electronics, which is another 360 quid or so. As for how useful that dynamic pack is, I have to say that yesterday I spent pretty much the whole ride in dynamic mode, and I did make use of the ability to fine-tune the traction control and the anti-wheelie as well separately. So I think it is an important part of the bike. It does kind of unlock more ability of it. So, and as for cruise control, I guess that's a personal taste. You can have it or not, but it's about 250 quid extra, I think. But if you have both of those, then you are starting to get on for a bike that's north of £11,000. And at that point, there really is a lot of tough competition about in the kind of super middleweight sector. I guess there's bikes like Yamaha's MT-09, which comes with all that technology and more power and more torque for less money. There's your choice of Triumph's Street Triple 765 in R and RS flavours. And if you want something that's slightly more scrambler-styled, I guess there's Ducati's Scrambler Full Throttle, which is about £11,000 as well. Now, none of those bikes are direct rivals for the Svartpilen. As we've established, this kind of doesn't slot neatly against any one of those three. But when you are talking about that substantial a sum of money, there is a lot of competition about. Now, I suspect the Svartpilen is never going to be a kind of a mass market bike in the same way that Street Triples and MT-09s and even Ducati Scramblers are. I think it is probably destined to be more of a specialist, more of a niche product. And I think that probably actually suits it a lot better because it feels special and different and unique. I can imagine you turn up to a bike meet on one of these and it would draw a crowd purely because there aren't Svartpilens to be seen on every street corner. And there are loads of really lovely details to get into if you wanted to poke around it. I mean, this exposed subframe, the fact that the back end of the bike is structural, there's no plastic panels back here, and other little details throughout that I think are well worth looking at. But if you're worried that, or have an assumption that this bike is a case of style over substance, I have to say my experience from the ride is that that isn't the case at all. This is a bike that has both style and substance. I hope that's given you a bit of an overview of the Husqvarna Svartpilen 801. As ever, you'll find a detailed written review on Bennett's Bike Social. That's bikesocial.co.uk. But if you have any questions or thoughts, don't forget you can leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to addressing them whenever I get a chance. But if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching.